Welcome to the inaugural WLSIS annual conference. This year it's on raising a Muslim child. It's very much an education-focused conference, and we are expecting a number of parents to come, and most of you sitting here from the age group look like your parents. So the nasiha and the advice is very much geared towards parents, but also those who are growing up here in the West and aspiring to have a family and so on. In terms of really the importance of this topic, for those who have children or are having children, it's really something that we can't overemphasize. The amana that we have as parents and fulfilling that amana to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and in an age where we all know that what there is on when we leave our child somewhere, whether it's at someone's house, whether it's in front of a computer, whether it's in front of a TV, the mass media age that we live in, and the filth that they're exposed to, and things that are displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we've never seen before. So it's really a time where in the mass age of Xbox and Twitter and YouTube, we really need to inculcate the right understanding in our children. And this today is very much about how we educate them, the tarbiyah and the spiritual development that we give our children in an age that's unprecedented. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the chair for today, which is Sidi Tamor, who is well known to the WLSIS group of scholars, and also very much known in this masjid as a trustee and social activist. So Jazakallah khair, and hope you have a wonderful and insightful day. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد عبدك رسولك نبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Assalamu alaikum. Not to really go over what Sidi Faisal just covered, but just again the main theme of the day is child, and there's three main facets. The first is going to be the educational side, focusing then after Zuhur on the spiritual side, and then finally going full circle to married life in Islam and the associated challenges with married life. The aim, inshallah, today is going to be to try and cover all the main aspects, because we know this genre is quite important, and even the government's commissioned a study for this age group. It's known as NEETs, not in education, employment or training, and they've done a study where if there's a brain drain in terms of skills shortages, it's going to create a big problem for the economy. So they've commissioned a separate study to specifically target the age group of 16 to 24-year-olds and how they're going to address these challenges. So inshallah, with what I'd like to do is open up the today's proceedings, inshallah, with the recitation from the Quran by introducing Sidi Zahir, who spent several years studying out in Syria and gained ijaza or license to teach, and currently is a science teacher, which will become a common theme throughout most of the speakers who are either educationalists or currently work as teachers. Jazakallah khairan.
والضحى والليل إذا سجى ما ودعك ربك وما قلى وللآخرة خير لك من الأولى ولسوف يعطيك ربك فترضى ألم يجدك يتيما فآوى ووجدك ضالا فهدى ووجدك عائلا فأغنى فأما اليتيم فلا تقهر وأما السائل فلا تنهر وأما بنعمة ربك فحدث صدق الله العظيم. الفاتحة.
Inshallah, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who's Shaykh Jawad. Again, we benefit from Shaykh Jawad, who's traveled extensively throughout the Islamic world, having spent time in Syria as well as Mauritania. And Shaykh Jawad graduated from King's College London and spent time within the secular schooling system as a teacher before his current role as head of curriculum development at Lady Nafisa. Not to embarrass Sidi Jawad, but I've never ever found out whether his impetus to learning was the Sheikh Hamza Yusuf's videos at Staines Road at the time of the Dajjal talk. And inshallah, I'd like to introduce Shaykh Jawad to the stage.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خير الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Just two corrections regarding that introduction. Firstly, I graduated from City. I went for King's for a year, but I actually graduated from City. Secondly, I have had the company of many great scholars, but I'm not a sheikh, so that's an important point to make, because really, you know, there's a difference between night and day between the people I've sat with and myself. So, inshallah, any benefit that I've got or any barakah that I've got is like what the Arab poet says about إن البغاث بأرضنا يستنصر. He says the sparrows in the sparrows in our land become eagles. So when you sit with these shuyukh, you start getting benefits that you wouldn't normally get because they've got this barakah. Just like if you go to certain lands and certain places, Allah gives you insights, even though you don't deserve them. So this is a very important topic, the topic of educating the Muslim child. And we live in very challenging times. You know, there's tremendous challenges, and they come from a number of different directions. I think the primary challenge is the challenge of secularism. Yeah? Secularism, Muslims living in the West and all the world over, because we live in a global village now, feel this tension between deen and dunya. You know, excellence in deen comes at the expense at excellence in dunya, and vice versa. And whereas previously, certainly before the Enlightenment, before modernity set in, that tension wasn't felt in that way. I mean, there was a tension between dunya and deen, but it was of a different type of. It was a different type of tension. Dunya being a distraction, but it wasn't like if someone couldn't get academic excellence at the same time as getting excellence in the deen. So secularism, is there a challenge of secularism? I mean, I think pretty much everyone here would have experienced that challenge, but what is the challenge of secularism? I would say the major challenge of secularism is its corrosive effects on the religious consciousness. Now, all of us human beings are born with fitrah. That's what we believe as Muslims. But certain societies can have a very damaging and subtle effect on the way we perceive the world. And how we perceive success as well. You know, like, is success just material success? Is success success of the soul? You know, all these different things, how we place our priorities, all these things are, you know, imparted to us by the society that we live in, and we have to think about these things very carefully. Now, how did secularism come about in modern societies? I say it came about by three processes, three major events in Western history, three divorces in Western history. And as we know as Muslims, three divorces are irrevocable. The first divorce happened at the time of the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, what happened was the religious consciousness was separated from the artistic elements of man. Now that's damaging because we as Muslims believe that Allahu Jamil wa yuhibbul Jamal. Allah is beautiful and He loves what is beauty. And we see the beauty within the world as pointing to the beautiful, yeah? Allah, yeah? So that was had a very damaging effect on Muslim society. And if you look back at the history of our deen, one of the most beautiful buildings in the entire history of Islam is the Dome of the Rock. And that was built in the Umayyad periods, just after the Sahaba. So these people the Salaf, were very attuned to beauty. It's something that we have lost now. So if you look at the modern Muslim world, you'll see that there's lots of ugliness. You know, if you go to the buildings and you see the streets, whereas the earlier Muslims had this really attuned to beauty. And this struck me when I went to that tremendous exhibition that happened in the Science Museum, where 1001 inventions. I hope you all had the opportunity to go to that. But you know, I noticed about the way Muslims approach technology. Not only did they make some startling discoveries, but there was beauty there as well. Whereas if I went to the other parts of the Science Museum, and I have been before, I found that these big contraptions were ugly. You know, and many of the people in this society will recognize that as well. Many of the Romantic poets were reacting against the ugliness of the society. You know, people like Wordsworth and people like you know, the many others. I've forgotten the name of the other. So the second divorce was a divorce occurred at the time of the Reformation. It happened between politics and religion. Now, I'm not trying to say that these things weren't necessary in the context of Western societies. There were injustices and there were reasons for it to happen in these societies. But from our perspective, the Muslim perspective, you know, religion, if politics is not informed by religion, you're going to have some types of fragmentation within society. Yeah? Politics is not neutral. You know, like, you can't just live in a society where the politics is not informed by religion and it won't affect you. Yeah? And the third divorce was at the time of the Enlightenment. And that was a divorce between religion and reason. And now, this very new definition of reason came about. How we define aql is very different to the way aql is defined in modern societies. The modern societies see aql as very cerebral. But we had a more balanced view of what the aql is, going back to this idea of, you know, the holism that Islam encourages. You know, there was a unity between the aesthetic dimensions of reason and the rational dimensions of reason, and there was even the pragmatic and the active dimensions of reason. Thought was not seen as something that was divorced from the happenings of society. Thoughts were not seen as something divorced from beauty. Thought was seen as fundamentally tied to beauty and leading to action. Islam is a religion that encourages action. I mean, it comes across in our definitions of Iman. I know there's some difference here. Imam Abu Hanifa didn't exclude Iman in his definition of Iman, but the others scholars did include Amal in their definition of Iman. But even if you look at the definition of Imam Abu Hanifa, when he defines tasdeeq, or how the Hanafi scholars define tasdeeq, they have a very activist definition of what tasdeeq is. So Islam, and this is very different from Christianity. You know, Christianity didn't have this definition of Iman where you have an active element, where thought ends up in action. So these three things led to a certain philosophy of education to come about as well. And this philosophy of education, which currently informs society, is very subversive, as I've said, to the religious consciousness. And the subversiveness and the corrosiveness of this philosophy of education is captured powerfully in a poem by Matthew Arnold, which I'm going to read. It's called Dover Beach. And one of the unfortunate aspects of the Muslim world right now, we become divorced from poetry. Whereas if you see the Salaf, their pastime was poetry. Imam Khalal, who's one of the great Hanbali scholars, he wrote a book, and Hanbali school tends to be the most conservative school about these things. And in his book, he wrote a whole section about the importance of poetry and how the Sahaba, Umar radiallahu an, how they would sit down in their pastime, just read poetry to each other. Something of this tradition still survives in Mauritania. Like if you go to the scholars there, it's called, they sometimes call it the land of 1,000 poets. Now the students, when they have spare time, not even the students, the people at large, when they have their spare time, they don't sit down and play video games and watch television. They actually start reciting poetry, you know. And I remember when I was forced to recite some poetry, some terrible poetry, because it fell to me to do something. But even about the most mundane things, about tea and everything. So they loved poetry, and they were like the Sahaba. And the Sahaba were like that. And Rasulullah liked listening to poetry. And there's a mutawatir hadith. This is one of the hadiths which are, the very few hadiths which are mutawatir, is inna min ash-shi'ri la hikmah. Yeah? That's one of the few mutawatir hadiths that existed. Truly in poetry there is wisdom. And we've lost that tradition. And I want to read this poem. It's a bit long, so bear with me, because I want to re-engage with that idea of revive this sunnah of listening to poetry again. And because I think it's prophetic, not because it captures the spirit of its age. I don't think Matthew Arnold's poem Dover Beach captures the spirit of his age, although some commentators have said that. But I think it's prophetic in the sense that it captures the spirit of the age to come. He anticipates where all this was leading. Where do these 3 divorces lead? Just like divorces cause, one of the most hated things to Allah is divorce. These 3 divorces have caused huge societal discord. And he captures this, and he laments about this in this poem. The sea is calm tonight, the tide is full, the moon lies fair. Upon the straits on the French coast the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand, glimmering and vast, out in the tranquil bay. Come to the window, sweet as the night air, only from the long line of spray, where the sea meets the moon-blanched land. Listen, you hear the grating roar of pebbles which the waves draw back and fling. At their return, up the high strand, begin and cease and then again begin. With tremulous cadence, slow and bring the eternal note of sadness in. Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. We find also in the sound a thought, hearing it by this distant northern sea. The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy long wave withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. Our love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. I think that poem captures very powerfully, this corrosion that secularism was going to have on British societies. You have to remember, Matthew Arnold lived at a time when the churches were packed. The Victorian age was an age where the churches were full, they were brimming. But he could see that where it was all leading. He was an educationalist as well. He was concerned about education, and his father was one of the great educationalists of his period as well. He was the one who initiated the rugby school and made some educational reforms. But despite all his efforts of his father, he saw that, that this age that was coming in, this modernity which has swept all over the Muslim world, will be like the sea, gnawing away at the cliffs of Dover. Yeah? And at the end, he thinks it's quite a desperate situation, because all that is left is just really to retreat from this. We can't do nothing about it. And, just have the comfort of our spouses and things like that, just retreat from this fitna. So, but there was another man at the same time of Matthew Arnold who didn't resign himself to the fate that he saw coming, and he also tried to struggle with it. And he was a very famous Christian scholar. His name was John Henry Newman. And John Henry Newman has recently been made a saint by the Catholic Church. But if you read Newman's work, I think you'd have been deeply disappointed by how things have turned out, because he really did struggle for it. He started the movement in Oxford called the Oxford Movement, where he tried to combat the effects of liberalism and secularism and its effects on the universities in particular. He wrote one of the great classics in the field of education known as the idea of the university, which is still read to this day. And he also was one of the great writers in English prose. His works are still read just because of their literary value. But Newman struggled with this, and he failed. But there's lessons to be learnt. There's a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, it's in Sahih Muslim, "As-sa'idu man wu'idha bighayrihi." The felicitous person draws lesson from what befalls others. What I'm trying to say is that we need to learn the lessons. The failure, when Newman failed, we may succeed if we take lessons from why he failed and how he failed. And remember, it wasn't a complete failure. Newman is an interesting character because his situation was very much like our situation right now as Muslims. There was a tremendous amount of prejudice against Catholics in that time in that society. Catholics were even at one point were forbidden from going from certain universities. And he struggled against that prejudice. And he wrote a number of books against that. And he also tried to raise the level of education in the Catholics at large. And he started the Oratory School, and it was recognized as one of the schools that raised the level of education amongst Muslims. Yeah? Sorry, not amongst Muslims, amongst Catholics. So we need to study his works, and particularly his idea of what the intellect is. His definition of aql goes very much back to how the Muslims used to see the aql. There's much more integrative view of the aql, where many of the different elements of beauty and logic and all these things come together in this one big whole. And he also talks about the dangerous effects of specialization, because specialization, as if I get time, can lead to people who have a very fragmented view of the world, who see the world through the lens of their specialization. And because they see the world through the lens of their specialization, they don't make the connections which is necessary to nurture that fitrah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. Okay, so now moving on to the current state of the Muslim educational establishments. Firstly, I want to start with the positives. We are legatees of great intellectual heritage. Universities started with Muslims, as scholars are beginning to increasingly accept. Scholasticism, according to a scholar, George Makdisi, started with Muslims. Humanism started with Muslims, according to George Makdisi again. We're a tradition that valorizes ilm and aql. Ilm is mentioned in the Quran more than 800 times. The aql in the word Quran has a very positive connotation. This is different from Christianity, where the aql is seen as fallen, being tainted by original sin. So it cannot come to the truth. But in Islam, aql is something which nurtures the fitrah and leads it to faith, leads it to iman. So aql is part and parcel, is wrapped up with iman. It's not something that you can separate from the nurturing of iman. And but how are we to tap into this great legacy? It's important to know what this legacy is, because if you know the great achievements that you achieved in the past, that can be a fillip and a spur for you to rise to those heights. And it's important to read what they achieved. But also it's important not to get complacent and not to see the very harmful effects that exist and the decadence that exists in the Muslim intellectual tradition. And one of the people who really looked into this was Sheikh Abul Hassan Ali Nadwi, rahimahullah al-Hassani, one of the great grandsons of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And you know, he brought many positive reforms in the educational institutions. There's a lot of work to be done, and Sheikh Abul Hassan Nadwi recognizes this. And he himself was inspired by Allama Iqbal. But he made some positive first steps towards bringing about an improvement in our educational establishments. But I want to read what his assessment of Islamic educational establishments is. In a chapter called Muslim Decadence, he talks about the intellectual sterility throughout the Muslim world. Intellectual sterility and the inefficiency of the educational system were not peculiar to Turkish life, but were common to the entire Muslim world. Muslims universally had grown inert both mentally and spiritually. If we do not, for the sake of caution, trace this stupor back to the 14th century CE, the 15th century was definitely the last to reveal any real intellectual life among the followers of Islam. It was during this century that Ibn Khaldun wrote his Prolegomena. In the 16th century, indolence of mind, slavish pedantry, and blind imitation became complete. One does not find even 1 in 100 among the ulama of the last 400 centuries who may with justice be called a genius, or may have produced anything to set beside the bold and noble intellectual activities of the earlier centuries. It's a very damning indictment of our current situation. And with regret, it's unfortunately still very much true. And, you know, if you don't have those institutions, especially educational institutions, you're not going to produce great people. Like, why were people Imam al-Ghazali reached the heights that they did? They went through these systems. Why did Salahuddin bin Ayyubi become the great general that he was? Because he went through these institutions. Why did Ibn al-Jawzi become this great orator? Because he went through these institutions. And if you put a great poet in a coal mine and all his life he just spends his life in a coal mine, he's not going to develop those faculties that Allah has given him. Similarly, if you follow someone who's got a great scholarly gift, and you don't allow him to develop those gifts because you haven't got the educational institutions that allows him to do it, don't think he's going to rise to those to high achievements. And we have to remember that there's more Muslims living now today than have ever lived before. Yeah? So there's more Muslims living today. And just by the law of averages, we should have people of high intellectual caliber because of, you know, just the profusion that we see today. But we don't. And one damning sign of this, and I'm not a great follower of football, but I think it illustrates what I'm trying to point out here, is the case of Zinedine Zidane. Now, Zinedine Zidane, as you all know, was one of the world's great footballers, and he was responsible for France winning the World Cup. But what a lot of people don't know was Zinedine Zidane, actually, before he actually went for the trials for the French football team, he actually tried his luck with the Algerian football team. And he was rejected because he was too slow. You understand? So now France became the World Cup winners. They could see that talent, but our countries, we couldn't. And that's an unfortunate, because we see it all over the Muslim world. You know, many of our best talents have to migrate abroad to get that high intellectual caliber that it is their right to have. Another saddening aspect of Muslim educational situation is the scarcity of women scholars. Sheikh Akram, Hafidhahullah, has spent his life gathering in just one field, the science of hadith, the contributions of women in that field, and it's 50 volumes. So we have this wonderful and great legacy of showing involvement of women in the highest levels of education. Because you have to remember, hadith was one of the most highest sciences. And now we're hard-pressed to find any great scholars, women scholars. And you remember, this deen is a deen of ijma'. The woman's voice in the scholarly domain is very important, because man is not made whole unless he has a woman. That's why marriage is nisf ad-deen. Now, if we don't have the woman's voice in the public domain, influencing the educational course that the Muslims take, that will cause fragmentation in itself. Because the woman's nature is different from the man's nature. She sees things that men will not see. That's why the Prophet ﷺ used to teach, the best of creation, used to seek counsel from his wife. So what are we doing not having a woman informing the discourse? It's saddening. And this is what Sunnism is about. It's about ijma'. It's about people talking amongst each other, people hearing each other's voices. We will have different perspectives. A person who studies fiqh will see the world in a certain way. A person who studies tasawwuf will see a world in a certain way. We have to have specializations. That's the nature of society. You will have specialization. You can't avoid it. But if you've got dialogue, then that fragmentation won't result. Because if you're listening to each other, the imbalances that come about through specializations will be corrected because you're listening to the voices of others who see things in a different perspective to you. And that's the secret of Sunnism. And Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, he said that ijma' is the hallmark of Sunnism. And we we don't need to what's happened right now. People don't listen to each other. I come from a background where I studied Ash'ari Aqidah, I studied the Hanafi Madhab, and I studied Tasawwuf, going to Imam al-Shadhili. But, now I meet some people who have the same background as I have. And as soon as you mention the name Ibn Taymiyyah, they switch off. And, they sometimes, they see that as, him as just some sort of someone with nothing good to say. But that wasn't the opinion of Imam Suyuti. Imam Suyuti, who had exactly the same views that I have, he followed the madhabs rigid. He followed the madhabs. He was a person of tasawwuf, and he was a person of Ash'arism. He called Ibn Taymiyyah Shaykh al-Islam, and he summarized his book on logic. And in his book of logic, he criticized the Ash'aris. Yet Imam Suyuti saw that there was some benefit in his work of logic, so that he took that. And that's what the early scholars were like. We lost that tradition of being able to take criticism and just taking the best of what we hear. And the early scholars were not like that. What happened in the Abbasid period, what led to the great discoveries that happened in the Muslim world, was a certain attitude that Muslims had and that we no longer have. It was an attitude whereby the Muslims used to critically appropriate what was coming from all the different world's knowledges, from Persia, from in India, from Greece. They made their own sciences. The science of kalam was not something that we can trace back to the Greeks. This is a misconception. It was actually a homegrown Muslim discipline, but it was reacting to challenges that were posed by the intellectual traditions of the Greeks. And also in algebra, how did algebra come about? We Muslims are proud, and rightly so, about the discovery of algebra. But how did algebra come about? It didn't come about from a vacuum. Imam Ibn al-Haytham, he studied geometry, Greek geometry, and he studied Indian arithmetic. And he made a marriage between those two things, and that's how algebra came about. So that's how Muslims were. We weren't people like the great Hanbali scholar Ibn Aqil said. He said, knowledge in a dunghill is no less a knowledge for being there. Imam Ghazali says the same thing. Al-Kindi says the same thing. That's something that we've lost. That we've become much more circumspective. We've closed, the membranes that surround this deen, they've become completely closed, whereas they were previously selectively permeable. Certain things that were compatible with our deen we should take in and fit into our worldview. And that's, in some ways, that's understandable because, the challenges of secularism is immense. And it was such a great challenge, the scholars didn't know how to react. And what they done was they just closed in. They closed in. But we need to change that now. And particularly, this responsibility falls to us in the West, because we understand modernity better than many of the scholars in the Muslim world do, even though they might have far greater spirituality than we have. And that's why it's important to travel to those people and benefit and take the barakah from them. Otherwise, you'll have the nefarious effects of the secularist onslaught upon yourselves. And you don't realize how nefarious it is until you start traveling. You know, when you actually sit with the scholars, you start causing a change in the way you think. Certain things that you took for granted, you didn't even realize, they start getting highlighted to you. They might not know about quantum physics and all these other things, but there's a very important thing that's being passed on. Something very personal as well. Now, one of the damaging effects in modern societies is knowledge has become impersonal. That's not how the Muslim tradition used to view things. Knowledge was we had a very personalistic understanding of what knowledge was. You know, the ijaza is not something just decorative. Yeah, it's something that sanctifies that link between teacher and student. Why did the Salaf used to look down upon the scholar who just used to take hadith from the books and call them just a suhafi? This is the scholars of hadith. You know, they called the person who used to take hadith from just books a suhafi, you know, just a journalist. Because there's something personal being passed on between a teacher and a student. It's a light. And if you don't sit with those scholars, you won't benefit. And that knowledge that you get might cause be a fitna for you, and cause you to, despite intellectual excellence, cause deviation in your hearts. Because remember, shaitan, he's a knowledgeable person, but he is the most astray of people. It's important to listen to the criticisms of our enemies. And people, and perhaps enemies is a strong word, because we shouldn't get in this bipolar view of the world. But people who will stand outside our tradition. Imam al-Ghazali in Ihya Ulumuddin says that there's 4 ways of self-criticism. One is to go through a guide. And he goes, they're rare, and they were rare in his time. So imagine in our times now. Yeah? That's what he says. And second, he says, go to a righteous friend. You know, a rajul who's salih, you know, and who's a bit older than you. Sometimes, you're your own age, but you feel that you can trust them and they can give you some solid and good advice. Thirdly, just mixing in society, and this goes back to the idea of ijma. If this deen is not a monastic deen, it doesn't make people just withdraw from society. Yeah, it makes people get right involved in society. Yeah, because society is supposed to be a corrective. Ijma wouldn't work if there was no society. That's why this deen is not hierarchical. This deen has got many different aspects to it. It's a unity in diversity. And finally, to pay heed to what your enemy says. Yeah? Listen to what they say. They might exaggerate your faults, but there will be a kernel of truth in what they say. And one professor, and he's not antagonistic to Islam, his book is quite good. He wrote a book on Islamic humanism. And he, first of all, really praises the Muslim achievements of the past. And he talks about how Muslims made all these new fields of discovery, And then he says about our modern situation, and it really echoes something I read, which Sheikh Nadwi said the same thing. He goes, by contrast, the situation in Islamic culture today is a result of lesser openness, a loss of confidence, a crabbed defensiveness, and chaffing chauvinism grounded in security. Where are the people who had the confidence, like Imam al-Ghazali and all these great scholars? Where are those institutions that produce those people who can be confident about their deen and take the challenges head on, face those challenges? It's important that we stop ignoring these challenges. We can't be like the proverbial ostrich that has his head buried in the sand. We are living in times of fitna. And fitna, if you look into the root of it, generally its connotation is negative, but it has a positive connotation as well, if responded to in a certain way. Fitna comes from the idea of assaying. You would, something that was gold or real gold or not would be put into the fire to check if it was not real gold or not. And that was where fitna, the word fitna comes from. So fitna are times of test. And we need to respond to those tests. We need to make those, take that challenges. And if we take those challenges head on and do all the things that are necessary to bring about the positive changes in accordance to what our Deen has taught us, we will grow spiritually. And we will produce great the institutions that we have produced in the past. And, you know, one of the ways of doing that, and this is something that the West has lost, is to put wisdom back in knowledge. Because what's happening in knowledge is an inflation of knowledge. There's lots and lots of knowledge right now. But there's no wisdom in that knowledge that informs that knowledge, that allows that knowledge to become integrated, to allow the tawheed of the knowledge. Because ultimately, all things point to Allah. And they all point to one source. All the different subjects, they point back to Allah. So their study should have interconnections. And that's one of the things that Newman was talking about, one of the things that Shah Waliullah Dehlawi talked about as well, when he talked about his idea of the Rahyun Qulli and the Rahyun Juz'i. He said we should have this universal intellect that binds things together. What does Aqidah mean? It means to bind. Yeah? So rather than a Rahyun Juz'i, a fragmented consciousness where knowledge just becomes fragmented and human beings become fragmented. Yeah? And we shouldn't become like fools, because people who have knowledge but don't have wisdom are fools. Yeah? And I was just recently teaching the girls at Lady Nafisa school about one of the kings. They were learning a poem about one of the kings named James I of England, and they said he was the wisest fool in Christendom. Because they said he had lots of book knowledge, but he didn't have wisdom. We shouldn't become wise fools. And the way we do that, we need to study our deen with these scholars who have this wisdom. And one of the things that I found instructive was the distinction between real gold and fool's gold. Yeah? Real gold is one of the most unreactive metals there is. If you put real gold in a fire, it won't react. It'll heat up, but it won't react. Whereas if you put fool gold, there's 4 different ways that fool's gold is different from real gold. Firstly, fool's gold is easy to attain. It doesn't come in an ore. There's no taklif that you have to make to get to that gold. The secondly is gaudy. It looks very flash and shiny. Yeah? The thirdly, and most importantly, if you heat it up, it reacts and it gives off toxic fumes. So, who is someone who's successfully negotiating a fitna, and who's someone who's not successfully negotiating fitna? Someone who's successfully negotiating fitna is someone whose soul is like gold, who's unperturbed, whose nafs is a nafs that is aiming towards a nafs al-mutma'inna, this tranquil soul. Yeah? Whereas someone who's like fool gold, whose nafs is like fool's gold, he's a person of ahwa. The scholars used to call the people of innovation the people of ahwa, people who used to be taken by their desires, people like fool's gold who used to be heated up and react and give poisonous fumes, anger. When Rasulullah said, La taghdab, and he didn't like even the Sahaba getting spirited when they went for jihad, saying takbir really in a loud voice. He epitomized and embodied tranquility. Do you understand? And that's who our Prophet ﷺ was. And similarly, we shouldn't just aim for producing lush and beautiful and grandiose institutions which are beautiful from the outside, such as like full gold shines from the outside, but have no substance, no value. We should get our priorities right. The early madrasa system, the Quttab, where did they start? The Quttab system, which brought about the huge changes, brought about the intellectual revival of Muslims. Where did they start? They started in the masjid, in the shop, in the outside, open, in the tents. By the midway to the 8th century, they were everywhere. And they led to the institutions that produced Imam al-Ghazali. So we have to start small. Maybe you have to make small steps. Don't try to make big institutions at the expense of producing people of caliber and having smaller institutions and giving your support to those smaller institutions. 5 more minutes, okay. I've got 5 minutes left, so there was a number of things I wanted to say. But I'll just have to narrow it down. 15 minutes. Oh, 15, okay. Okay, so let's look at the Muslim history. I was talking about this Kutab system. Now, what did the Kutab system focus on? The Kutab system focused on memorization, and it focused on imparting knowledge through taqleed, and it also focused on the Quran. Now, these are all been sources of criticism for Muslims. Critics looking from outside have said about the Kutab system that there was this unhealthy preoccupation with memory. And they also said that there was a very narrow field of studies that they used to study. And some Muslim institutions have taken this on board. All over the Muslim world, the sciences, the means of memorization has been put to the side. In the word, I remember when I was growing up, I used to often hear in Urdu, people say, don't do ratta. Don't just learn through rote. Yeah? It had a negative connotation. And there's a truth to this, particularly when you get older, but in the early years, memorization is very important. And our scholars were right in doing, focusing so much on memorization. Because the early development of the child is their memory is very powerful, and it needs to be developed. They live in, before they even start learning, they're in a state of orality. They have not learned literacy, yeah. And orality and memory go into hand in hand. Now, orality means that you haven't learned to read and write. And remember, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was the Nabi al-Ummi. And it's very important. Orality is being downgraded as well. It's been something that we don't really think about very carefully. There's such a rush to just get our children educated. But orality is something very sacred as well. And by depriving children of their period of orality, you might actually be doing harm to them. Remember, many successful schooling systems today start teaching their children reading and writing until the age of 6 and 7, and they do perfectly well in the educational systems that they go to. Orality, the way people think when they have this oral mind, is very different to the way people who are literate think. And once you're literate, you no longer think in that same way. The people who are oral, they use the memory a lot. And they see the world in a very different way. They have a much more concrete appreciation of the world rather than an abstract appreciation of the world. And they also, I personally think this is very important to appreciate the Quran as well. Because remember, the Quran came upon the people who are primarily an oral people. The great poets that they had produced were all oral poets. Even in the Western tradition, Homer, was an oral poet. And there's been also a movement against cliches. And cliches are very important for children to learn as well. They said that Homer, Western literary critics, they were studying the poetry of Homer, and they were shocked to realize this great pillar of the Western literary tradition was drawing from a huge stock of cliches. Because creativity was the thing that was put the highest, was really valorized after the Enlightenment. Particularly after the Romantic philosophers. Servile imitation was seen as something wrong. So they downplayed cliches. Whereas if you see Imam al-Jurjani, one of the great scholars of literary criticism, whose whose books were neglected for some time, and have been recently, people have been start looking at them again. And they've been shocked to find how advanced he was in his time. And there's many mother jewels out there that you'll see. If you look back into our heritage, there's these great scholars whose work has not been given the credit and has not been explored in the way it ought to have been explored. People like Ibn Khaldun himself, but Imam al-Jurjani as well. And he takes a very sophisticated view of literary criticism, the paramount of which is the idea of kalam nafsi, the miraculous nature of the Quran, and the idea of ijaz. And so he talks about cliches being can be very highly originally used. And so I'm saying that orality, when children learn from cliches and learn from memorization, they are much more likely to appreciate the literary miracle of the Quran than people who just straight away study texts, linear texts, which have a beginning and an end, and make people think linearly, and don't allow people this period, this part of their memory where they can look back and they used to think of the world, review the world as they did when they were children, and they didn't have this learning. And Rousseau talks about it. Many people in some of the Western scholars recognize this. I think this is something that Wordsworth was talking about in his poetry when he says that, that I wish our days, each of our days could be bound by natural piety, and that the child should be the father of the man. That we should look at the world when we were children, it was very different. We did have a very different take on what the world was. So memory, the recovery of memory is very important. Secondly, and I've only got 5 minutes left, is to do, the other thing was the limited range of subjects. That was also, has been criticized by outsiders looking in the Kutab system. But again, Newman's very strong here. He says that it's better to study a few subjects and study them thoroughly than having a smattering of knowledge in many subjects. And it chimes very much with what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said in a hadith, where he said, "Ma qalla wa kafa khayrun mimma kathura wa alha." A little that suffices is better than an abundance that distracts. And this was said in the context of wealth, but I think it also applies to knowledge. This just smattering of knowledge and not taking one knowledge and taking it right through to its end, and making interconnections with other subjects, and just having these parallel subjects that don't make interdisciplinary links, is a type of philosophy education which is harmful to the type of philosophy of education or the type of understanding of aql that Muslims had, and we need to recover. And Newman's works have been used by certain Catholic theologians. Alistair MacIntyre, he's wrote recently a book on universities, and he talks about recovering this. He also talks about fragmentation in the ways that Shah Wali Allah did as well. And we need to read these people, because there's, like I said, the knowledge is the stray, like the hadith says, which has weakness in it, but the meaning is true, that the knowledge is the stray, knowledge is the lost property of the believer. Wherever he alights at it, he drains it in. And he also talks about, the importance of making tawheed of these different subjects, to prevent fragmentation, prevent specialization. And to study 3-4 subjects thoroughly is better than just having a smattering of many different subjects where interconnections are not made. Because the knowledges have to talk to each other in order to appreciate the world in the way it's supposed to be appreciated. Finally, I think it's very important to work together. And I was watching a video recently, and it filled me with a lot of hope. It was a video called Gateway to Heaven. It was about Salahuddin's Minbar. It's a really beautiful video, and I really advise everyone to see it. But I took from it a sign, and the Prophet ﷺ, Kana Rasulullah ﷺ yuhibbul fa'al. He used to love optimism. Or not even optimism, he loved auspiciousness. He used to take good omens. He never used to take negative omens. He used to take good omens. And when I saw this, and I really thought this was a sign that things are happening which are good, you know. And I want to be part of. I hope that all of us, in our different ways, can bring about these positive developments I saw in this video. And this, what happened in this video was this. For those of you who haven't seen it, was that this minbar, the minbar of Saladin, was destroyed in 1969. And it had been there for 800 years, and it was one of the most beautiful pieces of that period. And it was burnt, and the Jordanians, who were custodians of that mosque, they tried to struggle to build it. And they couldn't do it because knowledge has been lost. So they didn't have the artisans necessary to develop the design of Salahuddin's minbar. But then, you know, people who felt, you know, the importance of this task. There was one architect who was originally a Bedouin. He started studying Islamic geometry. He found a book by Keith Critchlow called, I think it was called Sacred Geometry, he wrote. And he just became fascinated by this, and he went around the Muslim world collecting all the different designs that he could come across. Yeah, and you know, he spent lots of time just pondering of how he could do this. And you know, he eventually came to the solution of that. You know, and then the Jordanian government also facilitated that. They got artisans from all the Muslim world, Indonesians and people from Turkey. The people of Turkey donated wood. People from Syria. It was a really collaborative effort, and that's what I really liked about it. So people from all over came and helped to build this minbar, and it was finally built. And you know, the reaction of those people. You know, one of those people I remember, one of the artisans. You know, he was almost in tears. You know, he goes, they spent about 15 years of their life doing this, but he goes, you know, this is really worth it. You know, I can look back in my life and something I can be proud of. After 15 years of hard work, I produced something with such historical significance. And we need to become people like that, you know, collaborating, coming together with all our different skills and all our different abilities that Allah has given us, and we're all different, and produce institutions. Because, you know, and they've done that. They produced an institution in Jordan. And that's going to be a precedent for many other institutions. People are copying it because people imitate success. So we need to start coming together and making sure that these small institutions, these small sprouts that are coming out all over Britain right now, these Muslim schools, don't fail. It's a responsibility, it's a collective responsibility, everyone of us in this room, that we make sure that these institutions become like the Kutab did, successful products, successful, producing people of stature and height, people who can really deal with the challenges of their age, producing people like Imam al-Ghazali, producing people like Salahuddin bin Ayyubi. And inshallah, then that will be a life well lived. Jazakallah khair.
Any questions for Sidi Jawad? Yeah.
Yeah, you spoke about in the last section of your talk about that this system of education was criticized for the Qadab system was criticized for just restricting itself to a few subjects or probably even a few texts as well. How do you reconcile that with the problems which emerge from the fragmentation which comes from specialization? Which we see, like, for example, in Pakistan, we have a lot of professors, but the knowledge has become vocational, purely vocational, and it lacks the wisdom that you were speaking about, and the insight and the broadness and diversity that it needs in order to grow. So how would we reconcile that? Would we say that that is a strategy which we need to pursue or avoid?
Yeah, this is a very good question. You know, there is this tension. You know, the less subjects you study, yeah, the less complete your intellect is. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who has complete knowledge, has the real knowledge. Yeah? But as human beings, we're limited, and we can't study every single subject. What I'm saying is it's better to study a few subjects and study them well, rather than studying many subjects and only get a smattering in each of those subjects. So it's finding a balance. Look at your situation. Now, every situation is different. It's not one size fits all. Look at what your community has got. What things can you teach well? Teach those things. Yeah. And what things you can't teach well, the way you can. What it is important to do is to inculcate in your children a love for knowledge in general. So they realize that their knowledge is not. When they study in their schools, it shouldn't come to an end when they're finished. They should realize that their knowledge is limited, and therefore they need to take it further. Unfortunately, what's happened in the Muslim world right now, people just study, say, hadith, and they don't study fiqh, and they see things just, say, through the hadith of hadith, the way the scholars of hadith used to see things. And then people study fiqh, and they put a real big focus on fiqh, and they don't realize the importance of combining the two. Why was Imam Shafi considered the mujaddid of his age? Because he brought those two, despite being more on the hadith side of things, he brought a dialogue between the Ahl al-Hadith and the Ahl al-Ra'i, which resulted in a new fluorescence of knowledge. And what was great about Imam Shah Waliullah, he done the same thing. What did Imam Ghazali do? The same thing. He brought he brought a means for the Muslims to engage with the intellectual sciences of the Greeks in a way which was not subversive to the overarching aims of Islamic education. And that's what we have to do, find balance. And do things and do them well, rather than doing a lot and doing it poorly. Yeah. Okay.
Just regarding that, I don't want to, more mention, we don't want to preempt anybody else. There is a bit of a strange, I don't know if this is unique in Islamic history, but... So can I just give you the microphone? I don't know if this is a unique thing in our narrative so far, but when we speak of education, primarily we're speaking of academic vocational sciences. And regarding the thing you mentioned about specialization again, what is happening is we are learning these academic vocational sciences, and then we are specializing in these first, and without a good Islamic basis of shakhsiyah. So when we're approaching these sciences, it's not through the looking glass of Islam. So we have people who are studying psychology and sociology and hundreds of sciences, but the fact that they haven't got an Islamic basis, a strong Islamic basis, this is a bit of a hurdle for them. And what's happening, for example, for me, I've gone through an education system, and after completing my education according to my parent generation, now I'm starting what should have been the basis to that education by attending things like this and learning about how to make wudu and these things which should have really formed the basis of this. So what should our strategies be in regards to this? Should we be focusing, when we speak about education, on some particular sciences, that they should form a general basis, and from this then we springboard into specialized sciences, whether academic or religious, or how should we go about that exactly?
That's another very important question, and it's the reason why we see a lot of problems in the Muslim world. People, they go through academic institutions, and they don't realize that they picked up a lot of baggage. And then they start studying the deen. And they start studying a deen in a way which is not... they start having these wrong understandings. When they're reading those texts, they don't understand those texts in the way they ought to be understood. So we have to get priorities right. There's certain subjects have to be studied before others. Basic groundings in Aqidah and basic groundings in fiqh and tasawwuf should come before vocational training and before specializations. And our curriculum should be such that, these form the core of our curriculums. But we should do them in a way which engages with the age that we're in. Every age produced their texts, and they produced their texts understanding that they were age we're in. We need to produce new texts as well. That new matun that are sensitive to the needs of modern day people. We can't be idealists. We have to be somewhat pragmatic as well. We can't go just hark back to the Middle Ages and think that we can repeat what's happened in the past. It needs wisdom and intelligence, but definitely you're right. We should have at our core the fundamental sciences, but we should be working towards making that transition between these core disciplines and these further specializations, so that people don't feel this, dichotomy between those two things. So when they leave those initial institutions that they go to, they already have a furqan, a criterion to put all those things in their proper place. And that's what hikmah really is, to put things in its proper place. And that is not just learned from books, it's learned from teachers, just being with them. And that's another thing that we lost, the personal aspect of knowledge, being conveyed from teacher to student. Knowledge is not disembodied, it's personal, it's in human beings. So these things are important, and we should always pay close attention to them when we're devising our curriculums.